I don't give a lot of lectures, actually. But a friend of mine, when I saw Ralph tonight, reminded me of a friend of mine who's a nuclear scientist who gives a lot around America, and he was telling me that his driver got so fed up with him saying the same things at every lecture. The driver said to him, "You know, if you don't mind my saying so, I heard that lecture so often I can give it myself." And my friend said, "Well, I'm so tired, why don't you do it?" So he took the chauffeur's hat, and the chauffeur went to the lectern, and my friend sat in the body of the audience, and everything went superbly well. He did it word perfect. Except at the end, a man got up and asked a question of impossible complexity. And my friend said, "Well, that's really an interesting question. I'll let my chauffeur answer it." So if it's my chauffeur, I don't have one here, but I was looking for rescue. I would look to the back of the audience. I want to just start by a simple quiz. Which company was the first commercial underwriter of electronic computers, and where was it? When was the first successful trial of the jet engine, and where was it? Which country pioneered radar? Where was the first theater to use incandescent lighting? Who first conceived of the integrated circuit we know now today as the chip, and our lives depend on it? Connections engraved on a solid block, originally of germanium and now silicon. No connecting wires. Now, all these revolutionary innovations and more had their origins not in America, not in Japan, not in Germany, but in British genius. The company that reaped commercial benefit from the first commercial office system was Joe Lyons' Corner House, which got Maurice Wilkes of Cambridge to devise his system that was called Leo Lyons Electronic Office, based on Wilkes's electronic delay storage automatic calculator called EDSAC, the prototype store program computer. And Leo began doing clerical work in 1951. The father of jet engines, everybody in this room I'm sure knows, was Frank Whittle, a Royal Air Force officer. In 1930, when he was 24, designed and patented a gas turbine to produce jet propulsion. The first air-blasting run was made in Rugby, England, in April 12, 1937. Robert Watson Watt tested his radar system on the Suffolk coast in 1935, and 5 years later, as everybody knows, it helped to win the Battle of Britain. Most Americans identify Thomas Edison as the provider of the first theatrical lighting with incandescent bulbs. And in fact, it wasn't true. It was at the Savoy Theatre in London with 1,200 of the incandescent lamps created by Joseph Swan, who at about the same time as Edison had learned how to evacuate a bulb so that it wouldn't oxidize. And the chip, so ubiquitous today. How many people think Britain had anything to do with the invention of the chip? Well, you've got a couple of people perhaps here. Geoffrey Drummer, a graduate of Manchester College of Technology, worked on what became the Royal Radar Establishment, and in an address in the United States, he outlined how electronic connections could be made on a solid block of germanium without any connecting wires. And of course, everybody knows about other British eureka moments. The progenitor of the antibiotic industry, of course, was Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin at the University of London Medical School in 1928. The originator of the first hovercraft was Christopher Cockerell, carrying passengers across the channel in 1959. Now, I don't know how many of you said, "Of course I knew that." One or two may have known that all these British strokes of genius. The point of asking the question, though, is not to wave the Union Jack tonight, rather the opposite. Except in the case of the hovercraft, British industry, British finance, British governments successively failed consistently to exploit the genius of their native scientists and inventors. All these British inventions, every one of them, was superseded by the innovative energies of America. Frank Whittle designed and patented his gas turbine to produce jet propulsion, and it took forever. After the first test run, the inertia of the British Ministry of Air, the Air Ministry, the skepticism of the National Academy of Sciences, delayed production of the Whittle Meteor jet fighter until 1943, 6 years after the engine's first test. The Academy issued a lofty rebuke to Whittle. Not this Academy, I hasten to add, the National Academy of Sciences. To Whittle, of course, was a mere engineer, because it concluded, the present internal combustion engine used in airplanes weigh about 1.5 pounds per horsepower, and to approach such a figure with a gas turbine seems beyond the realm of possibility. As Whittle said, good thing I didn't know at the time. I didn't know I was so stupid enough to carry on. Now, the secret blueprints of Whittle's engine were given to the United States as part of our war effort, and the United States, as you know, came to dominate jet engine manufacture. I'm afraid that Whittle, impressed by American openness and somewhat bruised by his experiences in Britain, ended up as yet another enriching immigrant to the United States, finally working as a research professor at the US Naval Academy. In these cases, America picked up the drop balls and ran to touchdown. Same with antibiotics, which had to be mass manufactured, and we weren't up to it in time for the D-Day landings. In contrast to Jeffrey Drummer, Jack Kilby and Bob Noyce, 6 years after Drummer, gave us the chip because they got the backing Drummer did not, from their companies and from the attitude of the American government, which recognized how groundbreaking this was from the development of the transistor at the Bell Labs. And so that didn't lead to anything. And the British computer industry, and I knew the Ferranti family up in Manchester, the British computer industry was allowed to wither. I got very shocked about these things, and really very patriotically shocked. And when I first went to America as a Harkness fellow, I was proud, and et cetera, and I heard the endless laments about how the British never did anything worthwhile, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the eureka moment is a very attractive idea, the idea of not somebody springing out of the bath, but somebody putting a couple of fuses together and whatever. The act of inventing and improving, however, is much more difficult than the eureka moment. And here, Steve Wozniak, who's one of the co-founders of Apple with Steve Jobs, that authentic genius, wrote, as a tinkerer and inventor my whole life, I've learned over time that getting inventions to the marketplace is at least as important as the product itself. It was much harder to get people, even in America, to accept the concept of a computer into their homes and lives than to design it. Too many inventors fall to the field of dream syndrome. In fact, one of the great American inventors, Ken Olsen, when he was presented with a design for a personal computer, said, who would want it? What's the use of a personal computer? So he threw it away. And it was left to Gary Kilnall to invent the first operating system, which was pirated and eventually ended up as Microsoft. But that's another story I won't go into tonight. Now, admittedly, the Eureka myth is tremendously exciting and romantic. And unfortunately, quite a few people who are actually innovators like to mythologize. Thomas Edison was a terrific yarn spinner. One of his great achievements was to win the press on his side, which is very important because you can guarantee in the United Kingdom the press is going to be hostile to process and skeptical and sneer and snigger. And that was true even in the United States. In those days, they were ready for a good story. And Edison was quoted as saying that the incandescent lamp with a carbon filament. The idea was born to him when suddenly one night when he was absent-mindedly fiddling with a piece of carbon, and he thought, my heavens, this is the filament I've been looking for. Eureka! It's total bullshit. He wasn't sitting one night in the lab idly mixing carbon between his fingers. His notebooks are worth looking at, by the way. There are hundreds of wonderful notebooks at Rutgers University, and you can see there how he progressed from trying platinum, which exploded and hit him in the eye on one occasion, and only went to carbon. He tried carbon at first and gave up because it oxidized quickly. But once he got a young Turkish guy to evacuate a bulb and get the almost total evacuation of the air, he was able to use carbon, so he came back to it. Of course, he tried everything else as well. That was the way he was. So let us not be taken in by the myth of the lone inventor, even when the lone inventor himself propagates it. Now, the trouble with the Eureka myth, as I call it, is that it causes today managers and investors to overestimate the pace of invention and underestimate the fortitude, maybe the capital required to move from the early stages of discovery to a marketable product or service. Edison tried more than 3,000 failed experiments with the incandescent bulb. James Dyson, who's pretty well known, I think, here with his cyclone cleaner, 5,000 experiments. And when he succeeded, he couldn't sell a single one in a British store. Absolutely amazing. It's the largest selling vacuum cleaner by revenue now in the United States. And of course, it was stolen like so many good inventions, going back to the MRI machine, stolen by General Electric, and so on and so on and so on. Now, I think Watson Sr. Didn't really understand electronics in creating IBM. It took him a lot to move from the punch card to the vacuum tube. But his son did, and very fond of the son, because he didn't understand a damn thing about electronics. He couldn't read a circuit diagram. And yet he had the faith that electronics would be speedier than punch cards, and so he started on this system of creating the first really, really good computer. Forget some of the early ones, although they were important, they weren't as significant as Watson's 360. And what inspired him to keep going was the example of the Wright Brothers, where again everybody thinks, oh yeah, they flew in 1903 and flight was invented. Well, it took 5 more years to make a decent flight. The first one was no longer than this room. So that's very important to know. Invention is not innovation. Innovation is not simply invention or discovery. It's invention or discovery brought to use. The young molecular biologist Herbert Boyer, whom I've written about in my book, might well have been happy enough in 1974 to be the first scientist in the world to express a human protein in bacteria. But he was not content with splicing a gene in a university lab. He risked, and he certainly got it, academic odium, even in the United States, for trying to make a business out of it and setting out to produce and succeed in producing artificial insulin by putting up $500 over a beer with a young venture capitalist called Robert Swanson. And out of that venturesome nature of this scientist who could see the business possibilities, it came Genentech, the huge biotech company, acquired now by the Swiss, which revolutionized medicine and will continue to do so. And that's because the scientific side was important. But the progress was made in the United States in this because somebody was prepared to push ahead and soil his hands with getting the product into productive use for human beings. All these men, like Cyrus McCormick too, credited with the invention of the reaper, which revolutionized agriculture, that wasn't important. What was important about McCormick wasn't inventing the reaper. It was inventing a way by which the farmer could afford to pay for it, what we now know as hire purchase, which didn't exist. So he lent the farmer the money so the farmer could complete his harvest with the reaper, and then he'd get his money back. And he gave a long credit and cheap interest rates. So all these men were innovators. So an innovator, we might say a scientist seeks understanding, an inventor seeks a solution, an innovator, the distinctive thing, he seeks a universal solution by whatever means. And practical innovation, more than anything else, is the reason why America has forged ahead, although we're entering difficult times, because other land masses had just as many minerals, just as many people, just as much brain power. Think of Russia, China, Argentina. So why did America emerge as the leading innovative nation and give us so many of the things we take for granted today, including, by the way, globalization? Globalization was invented by an American trucker, a truck driver, age 24, driving cotton bales to South Carolina in 1933 during the Great Depression. He's getting very impatient because it's taking forever for the dockers to load the small bits and packages. Now, here's a eureka moment. Wouldn't it be wonderful if I could just drive my truck onto the boat and go home to my wife? 1933. What happened after that? Well, he got too busy to do anything about it, and nobody else really had the idea. So we again get to 1955, and he's done very well, thank you. He's made some money. So he thinks, well, I think I'll try that out again. And he succeeds, and in 1956, the first container vessel sails thanks to this trucker. Not thanks to some genius businessman, but thanks to a trucker. And it gives a flavor of where lightning strikes in egalitarian America. To mention that the systemic innovators include not only Malcolm McLean, the trucker, but a portrait painter, a cobbler, a Harvard professor, a deck boy, an immigrant seller of fruit and vegetables, a drug dealer, a frontiersman fleeing Indians, a hairdresser, a street peddler, a billboard salesman, a flour miller, an illiterate daughter of slaves, a 60s rebel on the streets of San Francisco, a beach taxi pilot, a seamstress, a piano salesman, a foreman in a power plant, a U.S. Navy seaman with nothing to do on a warship at the end of World War II, a playboy, a radio ham, a hardware storekeeper, a clerk, and, of course, a couple of bicycle mechanics who invented flight, innovated flight, because invention was the start of it, understanding the important thing. How do you fly? Everybody thought all you had to do was put a big engine in something with wings. Nonsense. That's not the point. The point of how they learned to fly was how they learned to ride a bicycle. Balance. So the point about what I'm making is that one of the very important points which I came to believe, looking at American innovation from 200 years, from the steam engine to the search engine, was the egalitarian nature and the openness of the society and the accessibility of reasonable education, though the trucker wasn't an educated man. So invention without innovation is a pastime. And now patents are important up to a point, particularly in some industries like pharmaceuticals, and hardly at all in others like machine making. But their role, like that of the inventor, has been greatly overplayed. A patented invention is only a beginning. Less than 10% of patents turn out to have any commercial importance, according to a study at MIT with the Lemelson program. And less than 1% have the seminal importance of, say, John Voight's inkjet for Hewlett-Packard, or for that matter, the cotton gin from Eli Whitney, or so on. Now, the point is this. What was the problem? Well, Edison, in his battles trying to get his lights into Britain, Not only did he invent the important thing about Edison isn't the electric light bulb. Somebody else would have done that within, like Swan did. Wasn't as good. Swan's light went out before it was any use, really. I mean, lasted a little time. The important thing about Edison was, of course, he realized that just to invent a light bulb was no use. You had to invent a whole electrical system of dynamos, power delivery, power stations, and so on and so on. The only thing he got wrong was the pricing, which was solved by another Englishman called Samuel Insull, who emigrated to America and worked with Edison. Edison himself remarked, the British have a beautiful system of patent law, invented, I think, by King Canute or some other ancient ruler who understood the needs of our time, in which the only advantage taking out patents at all is that you have the privilege of paying heavy fees to the British government. Now, some of the innovators who secured America's rise were inventors who carried their inventions to patents and to fulfillment in society. Some of them invented nothing. A handful made scientific discoveries, but few of them, this is surprising, I was really astonished, few of them over those 200 years were versed in any branch of pure science. Few of them were not. It was very surprising. I expected the whole thing to be the work of scientists when I began my researches, which took 5 years to complete. Their distinct quality is not that they found a patent or elaborated a formula, is that they somehow got their hands on the most important ideas and turned them into commercial realities with enormous impact. I mean, Americans still believe that Henry Ford invented the motor car, which was, of course, total rubbish. I mean, Ford was very, very late with the car, preceded by the Germans, preceded in his hometown by a friend of his who, Edison, Ford ran behind him when he did his first car. But the point about Ford is that he was an innovator because he saw something that nobody else did, particularly the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, who said, the motor car is a dangerous instrument. It is because it was actually killing a few people or making a lot of noise. Nothing has spread socialistic feelings in this country more than the use of the automobile, a picture of the arrogance of wealth, said Woodrow Wilson. And Ford's answer to that was, let's make a car for everybody. And that, more than the assembly line even, was Ford's great contribution, because the assembly line had been preceded in Chicago and preceded by an American genius called Oliver Evans in the 18th century, who automated a flour mill. Now, the crucial difference for me between invention and innovation was born on me when I was a young science reporter in Manchester, and I was asked if I'd like to go to the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington. I was very flattered to be asked. I'd written a few pieces on solar energy and how the world in 15 years' time was going to be transformed by solar energy. I was a little bit premature in these thoughts. And then I wrote a piece about nuclear energy, etc. Same conclusion. British nuclear energy was delayed enormously by research in making it safer was turned off basically by the hostility of the press. And it's still today, that situation prevails even in the United States after 3 Mile Island. So I visited the National Physical Laboratory, and the former colleagues of Robert Watson Watt showed me around where he'd invented radar, and they were fed up with the fact that that and the jet and so on. And why did they call me? Why did they invite me? I was a kid reporter. I did do pretty well at school, but I wouldn't claim to have been a great scientist. They invited me because they were very anxious about the government funding the National Physical Laboratory at Teddington. Guess what the national funding was for this very, very important British institution per annum? You got a guess? No, okay, well, I'll tell you. £900,000, not even £1 million. And they were going to get it cut. That's why they asked me down. They thought I could bring some publicity to them, as I did indeed do. Nonetheless, the fact is, however, patents, as I say, are not the crucial thing. But in the 5 years, 1966, 1970, 1974, 1978, and 1982, American inventors won an average of 45,000 patents a year. The British average was 2,700, the Germans 5,000, the Japanese 4,900. In those years, too many Brits hanging out in their garages were not Wozniaks and Hewletts. They were washing their cars. It is true that the British establishment has been especially gifted in putting people down, and the press is rarely patient with process. Here's a quote. Our society, Britain, has an instantaneous gratification thing. We admire instant brilliance, effortless brilliance. I think quite the reverse. You should admire the person who perseveres and slogs through and gets there in the end. Who said that? James Dyson, who had those 5,000 attempts to get a vacuum cleaner, not a vacuum cleaner, a cyclone cleaner, and then couldn't get a single British store to take it. So how can we explain this? I've just put a few things on the table, I think most of which can be elaborated easily. First of all, scale. Despite the Sherman Antitrust Act, big American companies merged and became bigger. Their market, of course, was a continent, and we hadn't got the European market then. And it was long protected by very high tariffs. One of the reasons British computers couldn't get in the United States was the Defense Department mandated British American manufacture. So me as a free trader, and all British free traders actually were misled by their idealism in this particular case. Market size and the Defense Department were two of the reasons why America came to dominate. The mainframe, I'm not talking about PC, of course, where again they were first. Secondly, City of London financiers were not big on mergers, putting two companies together with complementary skills. And it was left to a Frenchman, can you believe this, teaching at Harvard University, to introduce the concept of a publicly quoted venture capital company. Until then, you had to go around finding rich people or angels who could put up the money. The DEC by Ken Olsen, for instance, the mid-frame computer between the mainframe and the PC, he was funded by a venture capitalist rising out of Georges Doriot, forming of a company called DEC. I'll tell you, I don't like bigness, and I'm going to make a criticism in a minute, but until 1928, when the government intervened, lamp companies in Britain were producing 1,000 different types of lamp to meet variations in local wattage. Larger American companies with lower unit costs had more profit to plow into R&D, more standardization, and therefore more money to pay technologists and in turn teachers of technology and so on and so on. But it took until 1928 for the British to standardize. Even today, I get absolutely furious. Why doesn't somebody invent a universal recharger for every cell phone? I mean, who's lost their charger? I've lost hundreds of chargers. And then I discovered I got a new BlackBerry, and it's different from the old charger. So there we go again. Now, it's not smart at all. Education, although the quality of teaching in pure science and technology is indeed exceedingly high in Britain, but it was only available to a few. Then the US went in for mass technical education early on with the land-grant colleges, and then, of course, with the GI Bill, which we had a very pale imitation here. And so a light went off in everybody's minds when this ex-serviceman comes up and gets his degree in electrical engineering instead of going back to the farm. That happened, of course, millions of times, and many of the great inventors, or rather innovators, and then inventors first and innovators came from the GI Bill. Now, I went to university partly on my RAF service, which was undistinguished, but long enough to qualify. But I can recall the outrage here. You can, probably some of you. When it was proposed to increase the acceptance rate in universities from 2% to more, something shocking like 2.5%. The newspaper I was later to edit had an editorial by Sir William Haley saying, more means worse. More means worse. And of course, education of scientists and the liberal arts and so on was greatly frustrated by the British selectivity. And I don't think we got it right yet here, actually. I don't speak with any bitterness because I managed to wangle away around the system. But not only that, but there's a disdain for science. In 1956, government said it would 10 million over 10 years to expand technical education, and then got cold feet. It wouldn't call them universities, it called them technical colleges, so nobody would take offense in Oxford and Cambridge. Third element I would suggest, again for your discussion, trade unions. Throughout the last century, trade unions in Britain hunkered down, protecting both jobs and the way those jobs were done, irrespective of scientific advances. I mean, I went to the United States when I was editing the Times. I was director of Times newspapers. I went there in 1973, and I went to Detroit, and I saw the first word processing by Harris. Otherwise, it's fantastic. You can sit, you don't have to return the thing. It'll count for you. You can erase and go back and so on. And you can also do inquiries by connecting to an encyclopedia. So I got back and I proposed this to Times newspapers, and with great enthusiasm. They bought the computers, and then they found that the unions wouldn't let us use them. So what was laughingly called new technology, new, was still shrouded in sheets when I left the Sunday Times. It was still shrouded in sheets when I went to the United States in 1982. That was 5, 6, 7 years. And every deal that the unions made, they broke. I negotiated one myself, so I speak not only with bitterness, but with knowledge, too, of what actually happened. And that, I think, is still a great drag on the British economy, our restrictive factors of all kinds. The conservatorship, for instance, might have been introduced here for the dock union. Finally, of course, research and development. We've been blessed by brilliant individuals, what I call the 3 W's of the quiz, Whittle, Watt, and Wilkes. But the US was much more systematic in organizing collaborative effort and follow-through. Edison invented a way of follow-through from the eureka moment with his lab, where people were employed to experiment, then try and continually take it further. But nowadays, the United States has a problem. The diminishing returns of the big science. Diminishing returns. It's not working as well. Many of the innovations now are coming from small startups, younger people, without a huge amount of money. And in fact, the size of American corporations has now become counterproductive. There's a thing called corporatization. If somebody goes with a bright idea, we'll have a meeting. So you have a meeting. I've seen this happen. All right, well, when's the next meeting? Well, we thought next month. Jack's away on some seminar. We'll have it next month, January the 5th. Okay, so January the 5th comes. I'm sorry, Fred's had to go for a management meeting in headquarters. This goes on and on and on. And very people in large corporations in America, particularly the creative people, are enormously frustrated by the vast layers of bureaucracy that have developed under delays. And the Kaufman Foundation, Carl Schramm, has done a study of this and built on the work of Mankur Olson, that individuals, just like I was talking about the initial phase of this, having perceptions and discoveries, inventions like Raymond Damadian, who had the idea we might create an MRI machine. No giant corporation did it. In fact, they stole it off him. They said they wouldn't, but General Electric stole the MRI machine off Damadian, the idea for it. So Google's the same, of course, if you read the story of Google, which is in my book, but there's also a book by Ken Arletta on Google. So the history of radar I've mentioned already, I needn't go into that. The British had to come across the Atlantic, however, to help the Americans carrying a thermonic tube called a magnetron that would allow pilots in combat to detect enemy planes. What happened when Robert Watson Watt had given us this enormous gift, the foundation of a vast electronics industry. What happened? What happened? When he got to America, it was so different from Britain. 4,000 scientists at MIT were put on to develop the radar, out of which is the foundation of the entire American electronics industry. I was on a platform at an Edison event about 2 weeks ago. I sat next to the president of MIT, a very charming woman, and she said, of course, when we invented radar at MIT. So I said, just a moment, madam. And she was gracious enough to say, yes, of course, we did get it from the British, but it's quite true. So that was, can you imagine what it's like to be a British patriot, which I still claim to be, and hear this kind of thing. So what are we doing about it? And the point I want to stress at the end of this conversation with you is that there's science is very important, technology very important. I don't want to be misunderstood here. But innovation isn't just science, isn't just technology. Innovation is any, as Daniel Bell defined it, any reorganization which improves productivity and the lot of mankind. I don't need to quote Daniel Bell, but innovation, to my mind, can be development of a scientific discovery. Very important, the combination of elements from several apparently dysfunctional, separate. For instance, the invention of the camera. Who would have thought putting it in a telephone? Mobile phone. There we go. By the way, why did it take 5,000 years to put wheels on luggage? And now you can get a spinner. A spinner, the luggage will go everywhere, but it took that another 10 or 15 years. So individual innovators have worked for the most part today independently of big science and large corporations, by and large. So in conclusion, I asked them my own question. Is genius enough? Clearly not, if we think of innovation as a practical means of advancing the nation's well-being in a competitive world. Clearly not if we fail to explore, develop original discoveries and inventions. And I'm pleased to say the National Endowment for Science Technology here has now recognized this, say, we've been disproportionately focused on the science base and investment in scientific research and development, and they didn't conclude, but they might have done not enough on the nature of innovation. I'd like just to conclude by quoting somebody who got it right. And who am I to argue with him? Thomas Edison, the greatest innovator, really, in history. 1,903 patents to his name. As I said, patents can have less importance, but that's quite a significant thing. Of course, it includes the start of the movie industry, the start of the music industry, and so on. He didn't discover the electron. That was left to an Englishman called Fleming, but of course it happened to be developed in America. This is what Edison said. Talking to his associates in the labs, he said, we've got to come up with something that can be used. We can't be like those German professors who spend their whole lives studying the fuzz on a bee. Thank you.